Hey everybody, I'm focusing on getting Mass Effect Andromeda reviewed, hopefully by the end of this week, no later than Saturday the 22nd. So, in lieu of actually doing a full-on review today, I decided to go ahead and go over my thoughts on 5 different games that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I'm putting them all together in one video. And I'll be doing them in the order that I already showed you in the text on the screen. So let's go ahead and get started with Apotheon. Now, my coverage of Apotheon is coming to you courtesy of Mr. Jensen. He sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you for that. It is greatly appreciated. But as for what we're dealing with here, it's an action platformer mixed with RPG elements, a Metroidvania, if you will. It was developed by Alien Trap and originally released for PC and PS4 in February of 2015, and it later saw a release on Mac and Linux as well. And the first thing you'll notice about it is that it is completely unique in terms of video game artwork. I cannot name a single other game that uses an art style that is based on ancient Greek pottery. And despite a rather limited color palette, they've done a fantastic job of bringing that to a video game form. It looks great! And because it's so stylized, it's pretty easy to forgive the frankly pretty goofy animations. The sound design generally is pretty solid as well. It's got a rather nice soundtrack that's pretty fitting for what's going on. The voice acting is serviceable but otherwise unremarkable. I mean, it is an indie game, you gotta give them that. At least the voice acting's not outright bad, it's just nothing particularly impressive. And then there's the sound effects themselves, which are generally pretty solid. They work rather well for what they're trying to achieve, it's just that none of them really have the high impact that we'd really like them to have. However, unfortunately for the game, what really matter are story and gameplay. Now, I didn't get very far in the story because the gameplay was what ultimately killed this thing for me. But the story is that you play as a Greek warrior named Nicandrios, and the game starts out with a raid on his village of Dion, and you end up having to fight off the invaders, and after you do so, you end up meeting Hera, who says, "Congratulations, you are the chosen one, so you need to go to Mount Olympus in order to basically save humanity." Because the backstory to this is basically that Zeus had enough of humanity's existence and decided to prevent all of the other gods and goddesses from bestowing their gifts upon humanity. Now, you may not understand very much of that if you're not familiar with ancient Greek mythology, but basically the ancient Greeks believed that basically everything that gave them life, food, water, sunlight, all that sort of thing, was just gifts from the gods. So when they're deprived from all of that, they become desperate and wars break out and basically all hell breaks loose. So Nicandrios ends up being sent to Mount Olympus in order to recover all of the gifts that actually do give humans life and return them to humanity for their own good. Now, like I said, I didn't get very far into the plot, so I'm not really going to talk too much about it because I don't really have much to talk about. I didn't get past much more than the setup, but at least the setup was pretty interesting. I'm not really sure how they'd managed to avoid the plot feeling incredibly contrived and derivative, but it'd be interesting to see what they did with it at least. But really, I could take or leave the story. What really matters is the gameplay in this because they use a different combat system than you're used to from most action platformers. You use a variety of weapons that you can pick up throughout the course of the game, things like short swords, spears, javelins, slings, all kinds of things that you can attack enemies with, each of which does have durability as well, which is pretty annoying. Now, it's not quite as annoying as, say, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, where it breaks every 5 milliseconds, but it is still pretty annoying. Putting a durability system into a video game is never a good idea. All it's going to do is annoy your player, and that's precisely what happens here as well. But that's not the biggest sin the game commits. The problem is how you actually use your equipment to fight enemies in the game. You see, it requires the use of both analog sticks. You use one stick to control where you're looking and use the other stick to control how you're moving. Sounds fine, right? Except that this is a 2D game, and thus actually aiming with that second stick can be a massive pain in the ass. You'll probably notice in the footage that there's an awful lot of times where it looks like I'm just kind of flailing around like a moron, and that's because the controls just aren't really all that intuitive. You can either throw your weapon at enemies or you can smack them upside the head with it, and some are going to be better than others for that task. Obviously, trying to smack someone with a javelin's probably not the best idea. That said, aiming and throwing is a pretty annoying prospect because you have a pretty limited indication of where exactly your shot's going to go. And even just normal melee combat is really spammy. The whole thing just feels like a clunky mess, and considering that I'm already kind of sick of platformers, it takes a really good one to hold my interest, and Apotheon's just not capable of doing that. It's not a bad game, it's just the combat mechanics are fairly clunky, and it really is way more style than substance. If you like platformers or you like Metroidvania style games and the art style intrigues you, then you may want to give it a try, but I really can't personally recommend it. Next up is a game by Chris Chung called Catlateral Damage. And it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You are a cat and you run around and you make a gigantic mess. It has bright, colorful, cartoony graphics that are really not very well detailed at all, but for a game like this, do you really expect them to be all that detailed? The answer is probably not, but even then, the graphics are kind of ugly in this, actually. They're trying to go for this sort of cel-shaded look, but it really doesn't work out all that well in the game's favor, and everything just ends up looking really blocky as a result. Animations are barely existent in this, and basically consist of the cat licking its paws and swinging at things, and that's pretty much it. The sound design consists of upbeat but very repetitive music that plays on what seems like an endless loop, so it becomes annoying fairly quickly, and the sound effects themselves consist of meowing as well as a swishing noise, and not much more than that. The game does not pride itself on presentation, let's put it that way. Nor does it even really pride itself on gameplay, because literally the only thing you do the entire game is take swipes at things. I've seen it referred to as a sort of stress reliever or just a time waster, and that's pretty much exactly what it is. Either it's going to do something for you or it's not going to do something for you, and I'm in the latter case. I played this thing for about 5 minutes, got bored, and said, you know what, I'm not going to come back to this. Next up is Sentinels of the Multiverse, the video game, which was developed by Handelabra Games and released in December of 2014. It's a video game adaptation of the sort of deck-building game Sentinels of the Multiverse, which is actually a really fun game. If you're not familiar with it, you all play superheroes, and using your decks of cards, you work together in order to defeat a supervillain. The card game fans among you may be familiar with a title called Legendary, which is also a really fun game where you play as a bunch of superheroes working against a supervillain. But whereas Legendary is a straight-up deck-building game, this is something a bit different. Now, I'm not really going to talk too much about the card game here, because I feel like that's something I'd like to cover on my tabletop show at some point. But I will talk about the adaptation here, which is actually a fairly solid adaptation, all things considered. All the functionality of the card game is present and accounted for, and it's all automated in the way that you would expect it to be automated for a video game format. In fact, the only real problems I have with it are in the presentation department. They really don't spice up the visuals very much. It's pretty much just a straight-up adaptation of the card game with some background art to go along with it. Now, all the artwork is definitely in keeping with the actual card game, but it's also not the best artwork on the planet. It's certainly not terrible or anything, but it's not something that's going to make your eyes pop. And since there's almost no animation in this game to speak of, everything just feels very static. It's something of a missed opportunity there. Similarly, there's something of a missed opportunity in the sound design as well. You have a soundtrack that is definitely fitting for the theme, but ultimately very forgettable. You have sound effects that are very basic and pretty much just emulate the feeling of a card game with some occasional other sounds thrown in that really aren't all that impressive. Like I said, it's a missed opportunity there, because they could have made something really interesting with a lot of cool animations, and instead they stuck with a pretty reserved card game. And thus we have basically two groups that are going to get much of anything out of this. The first group is fans of the actual card game that just want a digital version of the card game, and the second is people who are interested in the card game but don't necessarily want to shell out the money for an actual box set that they may never use. And like I said, it is a rather solid adaptation of the card game. If you're familiar with it, you're probably going to be able to enjoy this, at least on the level of, hey, I'm playing a digital version of Sentinels of the Multiverse. And if you're someone who's either new to the game or has never played it before and you're interested, then this is a pretty decent infection vector. The tutorial's not really all that great, but then again, I already knew how to play the game anyway, so that's not really a problem for me. For someone who's newer, it may be a bit more confusing. And then of course there's the matter of all of the DLCs that the game has, which it has quite a few. They of course stick a bunch of characters in the various DLC packs, they stick a bunch of villains in the various DLC packs, and 5 of the DLC packs are straight up soundtracks, so that's a bit disappointing. But that said, if you get it on sale like I did, then you're going to find it's a pretty decent value proposition. Again, I had already played Sentinels of the Multiverse and knew I liked it, so I went into this thing knowing that I was going to at least get something out of it. But if you're a bit concerned about the $10 price tag, then I'd say wait for a sale, because this thing goes on sale very frequently, and it ends up being very reasonable when it is on sale. Because like I said, Sentinels of the Multiverse is a very fun card game, and this is a pretty solid adaptation of it, even if it is a fairly basic adaptation. Next up is Akane the Kunoichi by Haruneko Entertainment, which was released in May of 2014, and is a really basic pixel art platformer. The pixel art on the characters is fairly weak, with a bunch of animations that are very basic at their absolute best, and mostly just end up being very bland. And even though it is bright and colorful and cartoony, the graphics are such that they really aren't all that appealing. Sound design is considerably worse in that respect, with sound effects that are extremely weak, with music that outright gets really annoying within the first few minutes of the game, and gameplay that feels like it's trying to copy something like The Revenge of Shinobi or Shinobi 3, only it's really not doing it very well. The controls are just off. They feel sluggish and the jumping just feels imprecise. And the wall hang might as well be gluing you to the wall for all it does. It gets really twitchy and hard to work with when you're trying to actually do wall hanging. And on top of that, there's basically no variety throughout the entirety of the game. You're just going to be doing the exact same platforming over and over and over again against the same enemies over and over and over again. It gets really tiring. And it's also pretty annoying that whenever you complete a level, the level complete screen takes almost 20 seconds to come up. Just add that to the really bland and uninspired level design, the bland visuals, the weak sound, and the outright clunky gameplay, and you get just a complete mess. And I just can't recommend it at all. And the last game for this particular video is FootLOL Epic Fail League. This is an indirect control soccer or football for all of you non-Americans out there game developed by Lion's Shade and published by HeroCraft in August of 2013. And this particular part of the video is coming to you courtesy of Denim Ticken. He sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you, that is greatly appreciated. But here's the thing, I did an entire MTO on why I don't like sports games. This obviously is not fully a sports game because you don't directly control the sports action. What you do instead is use various special powers in order to facilitate your team winning on its own. Regardless, it's still a sports game which falls under the purview of things I'm really not interested in. Of course, a decent way to get me at least somewhat interested in a soccer-based video game is to introduce the concept of airstrikes to it. You see, that's what FootLOL is all about. All you do the entire game is place all sorts of things in the arena in order to prevent the enemy team from being able to function and in order to help your team to win. These are things like shields to protect your players or various attacking options like, say, airstrikes that you can toss in. Thing is that you can actually target anyone on the field, so you'll actually be able to accidentally click on a player from the other team and then give them the benefit that you were trying to give to your guy. That sort of thing is incredibly frustrating. And if it's that bad on PC, I can only imagine how it would be on what the obviously intended platform is, which is smartphones and tablets. It is obviously designed as a touchscreen interface. All of the buttons are rather large and easy to click, and everything is extremely simplistic and mouse-driven. And it pretty much just screams that, hey, this is a mobile port, because the graphics are extremely simplistic as well. The animations are barely even existent. What textures exist are of rather low resolution and not very well detailed. The graphics in general are not remotely taxing on your hardware, and they are all displayed at a pretty low resolution as well. Then there's the sound design, which is functional at its absolute best. The sound effects are kind of what you would expect from a soccer game, but also with some extra explosions and such like that thrown in that really are very low impact. The music is completely forgettable and also very limited. And even what passes for voice work in the game, which is a sort of ooh noise, ends up being really annoying after a while. Thus, it ultimately fails at presentation, so it falls to the gameplay, and I've already described to you basically the exact particulars of the title. Between the levels, you can change the loadout of your power slots by just selecting what you want to have in those power slots, and then filling in skill points until you have the desired number of those particular powers. Of course, you gradually unlock more power slots as you go through the game and hit various milestones, as well as be able to purchase them in the in-game store with the currency that you earn by simply playing the game. Said currency is also used for upgrading the amount of skill points you have, as well as the player's stats, so you can increase their speed and increase their accuracy. And of course, you can also use it to purchase completely pointless cosmetic items for your team. There's even a stat where you can pour in-game currency into to get more in-game currency. It's just kinda goofy. The thing is, it suffers from the problem of OMG so random humor, and that's only funny the first couple of times you see it. After a while, placing cows in the middle of a soccer field just gets pretty tedious, and that's exactly what happens with FootLOL Epic Fail League. It is very simplistic, it is very repetitive, there's a sort of grind going on in order to actually unlock all of the powers as well as the power slots, and that just takes a long time. Or at least it feels long, probably because the game is so monotonous. Sure, it may be only $5, but let's face it here, the gimmick wears thin extremely quickly, and what you're left with is something that's frankly pretty boring. Because like I said, OMG so random humor doesn't last very long, and once you're past that, you find that the game is rather shallow and very, very monotonous. And thus, I just can't recommend it at all. And there you have it, folks. My thoughts on 5 different games that I don't really have all that much to say about, and thus they aren't going to be getting their own standalone videos. As I said earlier, I'll probably cover Sentinels of the Multiverse on the tabletop show as well, so if you're interested in that, stay tuned, and I'll see about getting a video up on that as soon as I can. And as I said early on in this video, I am working on the Mass Effect Andromeda review, so stay tuned for that as well. And last but not least, I have an announcement concerning content for the channel going up most likely tomorrow, but if something doesn't work out, then it will go up on Wednesday instead. Regardless, it is coming out either on Tuesday or Wednesday of this week, so stay tuned for that as well. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll catch you all in later videos.